Okay, let's unpack this. If I were to ask you what the biggest driver of global change in the late 18th century was, most of us, myself included, would probably immediately think, the Industrial Revolution.
Right, that's the standard answer.
Exactly. But what if I told you many historians are now pretty skeptical about its immediate widespread impact before, say, the 1830s? That seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. I mean, it's baked into how we think about that era. But what's truly fascinating here is that while industrialization definitely shaped the long-term future, for the period between 1780 and 1914, particularly that end of the old regime and those complex passages to modernity, there were far more subtle yet incredibly profound shifts already happening. Right. These were accelerating divergences in, economic performance, state organization, and even civil societies across the globe.
Right, and that's why this deep dive is so important for us today. We're going to dive into Christopher Allen Bailey's The Birth of the Modern World, 1780-1914, which is just this incredibly comprehensive text giving us this amazing global view.
It really provides that bigger picture.
Totally. Our mission here is to pull back the curtain on these less understood transformations. And you're going to discover some, surprising global connections and the complex, multifaceted reasons behind Europe's eventual preeminence. It's way beyond that simplistic rise of the West story.
Mm-hmm.
This deep dive is designed to give you a shortcut, really, to being truly well-informed about this pivotal, often misunderstood period.
It's all about recognizing the nuanced, simultaneous changes happening worldwide rather than just a single linear, European-centric story. It challenges our basic assumptions about how the modern world actually came to be.
Okay, so if the factories weren't the whole story, especially early on, what else was secretly reshaping the world at this pivotal moment? Our source suggests that before 1830, two other major types of social and economic change actually loomed much larger in world history than industrialization itself.
That's right. The first of these is what some historians call the Great Domestication.
Great Domestication, okay.
Yeah, imagine a final, really rapid phase of human movement away from nomadism and small-scale farming, moving instead towards regular, intensive agriculture, exploiting the land much more intensely. This process really accelerated on the remaining nomadic frontiers after about 1650.
So what lit the fuse for this massive global shift? What was driving it?
Well, several factors kind of converged. First, you had rapid human population growth.
Uh-huh.
This was partly because major pandemics like the bubonic plague were winding down in Eurasia.
Yeah. Hey.
And you even saw a strong recovery in Central and South America after the, devastating impact of European diseases.
Right.
Then there was the spread of incredibly nutritious new food varieties from the Americas, potatoes, maize, that sort of thing. They improved fertility and disease resistance across the old world.
So people were healthier, living longer?
Exactly. And as populations grew, pioneer peasants literally spilled into less populated, forested, and grazing lands, clearing them, bringing them under cultivation.
And the state played a surprising role in this. My first thought might be that states just let people farm where they wanted, but you're saying they actively pushed for this.
Precisely. From places like Indonesia all the way to northern Scandinavia, the growth of larger states actively encouraged the expansion of cultivation and settlement.
Why, though? What was in it for the state?
Well, think about it. Settled people were much easier to tax. Simple as that, really. And states constantly needed soldiers, they needed labor, and crucially, they needed money. It was a strategic imperative for centralizing power.
That makes so much sense when you put it like that.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples? Where was this great domestication happening?
Certainly. All over, really. In Russian Siberia, for instance, after fur-bearing animals were largely hunted almost to extinction by 1700, pioneer peasants started moving into that huge hinterland. Farming replaced fur trapping. We also see European agriculture expanding on its own internal frontiers, hills, forests, marshlands. Think of forests being cleared in Scotland or peat bogs being divided up in Gaelic Ireland to create new farmland.
And in the Americas.
Of course.
Yeah.
European colonists pushing cultivation beyond the Atlantic seaboard, up river valleys, encroaching on indigenous hunting grounds. That's a classic example.
And this wasn't just happening in colder climates, right?
Not at all. Look at Latin America and the Caribbean. You saw a huge expansion of cash crops, grain, sugar, tobacco.
Big moneymakers.
Huge. In the Buenos Aires hinterland, for example, indigenous nomads were often driven away or settled as ranch hands as the cattle hide trade boomed. This was an older style of domestication, sure, but tied intimately to modern commerce and very brutally linked to African slavery leather shipped out, enslaved people brought in.
So it wasn't just European powers driving this everywhere. What about within non-European societies themselves? Were they doing this too?
Yes, absolutely. Even within Africa, societies like Madagascar saw intensive rice agriculture expand significantly between the 15th and 18th centuries. This was often driven by ambitious local chieftains using serf labor to increase their own wealth.
Wow.
Later, the terrible Atlantic slave trade actually reinforced this demand for more food production to sustain it all. Even in the Pacific, you had Maori immigrants in New Zealand clearing forests for sweet potato cultivation between 1500 and 1800.
And Australia.
Pig raising and gardening, introduced from New Guinea, started to modify Aboriginal lifestyles in parts of Australia. And it wasn't just states or chieftains, even religious institutions like Sufi hospices in the Islamic world or Christian missions in the Americas played a part in encouraging settled agriculture.
So this great domestication sounds like a really fundamental reordering of how people lived and worked across the entire globe. What's the biggest takeaway from this first overlooked transformation?
I think the key insight is that this rapid plowing up of prairies, jungles, and steppes provided crucial raw materials and, importantly, labor for the emerging commercial economies of the 19th century.
Right, the labor aspect is huge.
It is. Former forest dwellers and settled herdsmen often became, well, the exploited labor force, the coolies and indentured laborers, often for dominant white populations. But, and this is absolutely critical, this wasn't just something done to the rest of the world by Europe. It was a formative force within modern societies from Indochina to Central Africa. It was a shared global transformation of land use and labor patterns.
That's a really powerful shift in perspective.
Okay.
And this brings us to the second major overlooked transformation, the industrious revolutions. How is this different from domestication?
Okay, so this was distinct, though sometimes related. It happened primarily within older, established farming societies. It involved a reorganization of demand and resources, often without leading directly to early industrialization, like in Britain.
So not necessarily new technology, but changing how people worked and what they wanted.
Exactly. It's a concept developed by the historian Jan de Vries. He describes it as an increase in prosperity driven by changes in consumer desire, and how households basically organize their labor differently to get the things they now wanted.
Okay, give me an example. How did this play out?
The breakfast package is a perfect illustration. In places like Holland, southern England, or the 13 colonies in America, people started consuming coffee and later tea more widely.
Right, I've heard about this.
And that went hand in hand with buying sugar, finer breads, maybe easily replaceable ceramic plates instead of wooden ones.
So more stuff from outside the home.
Precisely. It wasn't just about new foods. It signaled potentially higher calorie intake, but also introduced a new kind of time discipline. There's work by Hans-Joachim Wolff suggesting this really permeated English life between 1750 and 1830, and it created new patterns for, sociability and showing off status within the household.
And it obviously boosted trade.
Absolutely. Boosted trade in specialist foods, disposable crockery, all those things people now desired.
This completely flips the script on the idea that the factory floor was the only path to modernity. It shows this global tapestry of economic ingenuity, often before or even instead of industrialization as we usually picture it.
Exactly. So while this growing demand eventually helped fuel early industrialization in Britain, these industrious revolutions didn't always lead to factories elsewhere. They often increased prosperity in a stealthier way, reflecting changes in consumer desire that stoked demand differently.
Right. So this pattern industrious revolution, without early industrialization, you saw that in places like the Low Countries, parts of Germany, coastal North America, Mexico, coastal Brazil before 1850.
Yes, very common. They only really turned to large-scale factory production much later.
And what's fascinating here, you're saying, is how this concept stretches way beyond Europe. Historians now see similar shifts, changing consumer values and local production in other parts of the world, too.
Absolutely. I mean, consumer values were culturally specific, of course, but the broad social changes seem to flow from these industrious revolutions globally.
Okay, so let's take China, for example, during the 18th century. Was it really undergoing an industrious revolution, too? That challenges a lot of older ideas.
It really does. Our source, Bailey, describes 18th century China with buoyant trade, increasing specialization between regions, and peasants and gentry actively engaging with the market. It sounds strikingly similar to European industrious revolutions.
How so? What was changing within households?
Well, household labor and consumption were reorganized. You see women increasingly working as artisans, making textiles or other goods. The consumption of fine handicrafts, think porcelain, printed fabrics, lacquered boxes, spread from the elite scholar gentry down to merchants and even rich peasants.
And this wasn't just about exporting porcelain to Europe, was it?
Not at all. A huge amount of the porcelain produced in 18th century Central and South China was for the internal market, for, middling officials, local elites. Luxury became a goal in itself, objectified through owning these goods. It was a key motor of change.
And this happened without massive cities like in Europe.
That's another key point. The Chinese economy showed extensive production without that same scale of urbanization. Labor was becoming increasingly free and mobile, and credit expanded, fueled partly by all that New World silver flowing in.
Wow. What about Japan? Do we see parallels there?
Definitely. Similar patterns in late 17th and 18th century Japan. You see more markets popping up in the countryside, labor becoming more specialized, suburban elites accumulating goods.
And consumption patterns?
The samurai class really set the trends for things like silks, metal items, ceramics. And the Japanese famously reinvented the Chinese tea ceremony after 1600, which created its own demand.
Any other examples?
Well, demand for finely honed swords and ceremonial armor kept artisans very busy. And crucially, Japan had pretty stable population growth during this time, which allowed slow gains in productivity to accumulate. So you see incremental improvements in farming and fishing, even without major inventions like the spinning jenny.
Okay, let's shift to India and the Middle East. We often hear narratives that paint them as stagnant during this period, maybe dominated by tribute-taking empires. Does this new lens change that picture?
It fundamentally reevaluates it. It challenges those traditional views of just tribute economies. Recent evidence suggests pockets of relative prosperity even amidst political turmoil.
Like where?
Well, rural people in the western Indian uplands, for instance, acting as entrepreneurs. President Parthasarathi, a historian known for challenging these Eurocentric views, even estimates that Indian weavers might have had a higher standard of living than British ones in the mid-18th century.
Really? Higher?
Potentially, yes. And you saw low-status country people gaining wealth and renown, which kind of contradicts those rigid ideas about fixed caste divisions stopping any mobility.
So even with the wars and instability we hear about, production wasn't necessarily wiped out.
That's right. Production was often just relocated rather than destroyed, and new groups of aspiring consumers emerged. Think of the Marathas in India or the Zans and Qojars in Persia. They became significant buyers of fine silks, cottons, horses by the end of the 18th century. The old decline of the rest narrative is just far too simplistic.
Okay, but there was some kind of relative shift happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we interpret the sense that things were slowing down in some regions outside Europe by the later 18th century?
That's a really important nuance. There was some slackening of agricultural and commercial growth outside Northwest Europe and North America by around 1770, and political systems were definitely struggling in places. Think of King China's imperial overstretch, or India becoming a kind of zero-sum game between rival states fighting over resources, or the Ottoman Empire's internal issues.
So not a total collapse, but challenges.
Exactly. It was a patchy and relative process, as Bailey puts it. It was not a uniform decline of the rest, comparable to the huge economic gaps that opened up by, say, 1900.
That's a crucial distinction. And we see counterexamples, right?
Yeah.
Areas that adapted or stayed prosperous for longer.
Absolutely. Think of Egypt under Muhammad Ali in the early 19th century, or the Indian textile industry, which survived, maybe on borrowed time, until at least the 1820s. Parts of the subcontinent remained relatively prosperous until a wider depression hit in the 1830s.
Okay. So if Europe's rise wasn't simply the failure of Asia or Africa, what was it then? It seems rooted in a specific convergence of features within European society and its states.
Yes, and connecting this to the bigger picture, Kenneth Pomerantz's arguments are really helpful here in re-examining Europe's economic advantages.
What are the key ones?
Well, first, Europe had access to a truly massive hinterland of underused resources, both on its own continent and, crucially, in the Americas.
The Americas loom large again.
They do, and we absolutely cannot ignore the brutal reality of the slave plantation system. It provided Europe with, as Pomerantz calls them, massive, cheap agricultural provinces, especially the Caribbean for sugar, plus imports of protein-rich fish, often caught off North American coasts.
It was a horrific but incredibly effective form of industrious revolution that fueled European power.
Absolutely devastating, yes. And Europe also had an outlet. It exported surplus population to the Americas, which helped reduce the kinds of population density problems that later affected parts of Asia.
What about agriculture within Europe itself?
Well, while farming productivity was high in parts of India and China in the 17th century, new crop varieties like potatoes and more intensive production methods allowed some European regions to really leap forward in the 18th century. They could feed growing urban populations faster than perhaps was possible in Asia at that point.
And energy.
Coal. Northwestern Europeans, particularly the British, rapidly exploited coal reserves. This drove innovations like better water pumps needed for deeper mines, which led to better iron casting and eventually steam power.
And transport.
European transport investments also rose rapidly: canals, better roads. This contrasts with what some call China's high-level equilibrium trap in transport, where abundant, cheap labor and well-established low-tech solutions like the canal system made massive investment in new, transformative infrastructure seem less urgent or economically sensible at the time.
Okay, so those are some key economic factors. But beyond just economics, what institutional and financial advantages did Europe develop that really set it apart? This seems crucial.
It really is. Europe developed some critical institutional and financial edges. Think about stable legal institutions, Engels common law, Roman law traditions elsewhere. These increasingly guaranteed property rights, not just for elite families, but for individuals too.
So people felt their property was safer.
Relatively speaking, yes. Inventors could actually become wealthy from their ideas. Rural and urban property was relatively safer from arbitrary seizure by the state compared to some other regions. There seems to have been an unspoken agreement among elites not to tamper with property rights too excessively. Even during the French Revolution, confiscations were surprisingly targeted, not wholesale.
And how did that compare to, say, Asia or Africa?
Well, the source suggests property often remained more vulnerable to state intervention elsewhere. In the Asante Kingdom in West Africa, for example, rich families could be hit by punitive death duties. Ottoman sultans sometimes burdened commercial families with state contracts that ended up impoverishing them.
So less security for long-term investment.
Potentially, yes. In China, while lineage rights were generally secure, wealthy merchants were often asked, pressured to make large donations to the state during crises. Japan seems to be an interesting exception here, with its system of primogeniture and stable feudal leadership allowing for more long-term capital investment with cumulative rewards.
This sounds like a really fundamental difference in the background conditions for economic activity. And Europe's financial institutions, were they different too?
Yes, significantly. Europeans developed financial institutions that were increasingly independent of either merchants or governments. Think of the Dutch pioneering the joint stock company, like the East India Company.
Cooling risk, separating ownership and management.
Exactly, a cornerstone of modern capitalism. Then you have the Bank of England providing a sort of independent check on the state's finances, and the concept of a national debt creating transparency and trust between the elite and the government. Paper money, regional banks making borrowing and lending easier.
So all this infrastructure allowed them to capitalize more effectively.
That seems to be the argument. Europeans could capitalize not just on their own industrious revolutions, but also on those happening elsewhere. Think Chinese tea, Javanese spices, Indian textiles. They were better positioned to capture the greatest value added from global trade because they controlled the finance and the shipping.
Even if merchants elsewhere were sophisticated?
Right. Asian and Middle Eastern merchants were often incredibly sophisticated with extensive networks. But they generally lacked this overarching framework of law and corporate organization that provided such security and scalability in Europe.
And then we have to touch on something quite grim, but clearly a factor according to the source: the role of warfare.
Indeed. It's unavoidable. Bailey argues Europeans simply became much better at killing people.
Humble assessment.
It is. The savage religious and dynastic wars of the 17th century, particularly, forged intense links between war, state finance, and commercial innovation. Needing money for war spurred financial development.
And how did that translate into a global advantage beyond just Europe?
Well, these links gave Europe a brutal edge. European warfare was uniquely complicated and expensive because it was often amphibious, projecting power by both land and sea. This required incredibly sophisticated systems to finance and supply navies and armies simultaneously.
Like protecting the Caribbean slave colonies.
Exactly. Protecting that immensely profitable but vulnerable slave production system required huge naval investments. The British fleet in particular became crucial. It reduced Britain's own vulnerability to invasion and could be dispatched globally. This forced rivals, like Peter the Great of Russia, scrambling to build a navy, into a costly race to catch up.
So a constant competitive arms race, in a way.
Pretty much. The mutual struggles between these medium-sized European states drove constant innovation in land warfare to new tactics, deadlier weapons, better financial systems to support professional armies. This constant pressure conferred a significant competitive advantage when Europeans expanded into other parts of the world and competed for global trade.
And again, it comes back to who captures the profit.
Right. It was usually European ships and commercial companies backed by this military power, not the original Asian or African producers, who captured the greatest value added as world trade expanded. They controlled the transport and the sales in the world's biggest markets.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit and look at the evolution of the state itself and identity. When we look back at, say, 1790, European states still seem quite complex, right? Fuzzy boundaries, overlapping powers, maybe not so different from empires in Asia or Africa.
That's a really important point. Russia, for instance, ruled over a hugely diverse population. Germany was fragmented into countless states. Even Britain and France, which we think of as coherent nation-states, still had significant cultural diversity and strong local power centers like the parlements in France.
So what was the slow underlying shift that began to change this, to create more unified identities?
Well, there were long-term developments at work, creating wider connections and a more uniform culture and politics, especially in places like Britain and France. Economic integration played a role. Think of London's growing dominance, creating a sort of British patriotic economy where Scottish merchants exported through London.
And shared culture among the elites.
Yes, a shared elite culture emerged through similar education, legal systems, even shared patterns of consumption and leisure among the gentry and merchants across wider regions.
And how did intangible things like religion and war play into forging these identities? We touched on war-driving innovation, but what about identity?
They played a massive role. Being English or British, for example, became deeply tied to Protestantism, especially during the long series of wars against Catholic France and Spain in the 18th century. It defined who we were against a dangerous other.
In France.
French identity was strongly shaped by its history as a Catholic state, the increasing use of the French language in sermons and administration, and this idea of a universal civilizing mission. Again, identity often formed in opposition to others, the English, or later the Germans. Even in fragmented Germany, writers and thinkers started to foster a sense of Germanness, often contrasted with the French.
It really sounds like the lines of belonging were gradually getting sharper, more defined.
Yes. And you also saw a shift from purely dynastic politics loyalty to a ruling family towards more territorial politics. States began fighting to protect their land, their borders. Elite nationality started to solidify in dominant capital cities like Berlin, St. Petersburg, Paris.
Even local issues could feed into this.
Absolutely. Disputes over something as seemingly small as fishing rights could ignite patriotic fervor, binding people to their locality and, by extension, the larger state. And don't forget the role of the state itself. Enlightened despots like Maria Theresa in Austria or rulers in Prussia and Russia started pioneering state education.
Standardizing language, creating common knowledge.
Exactly. Standardizing languages, fostering a sense of common history and culture. This spread a print culture of nationalism through schools, newspapers, books.
So while the French Revolution certainly accelerated and sharpened these notions of citizenship in the territorial nation, it was clearly building on these much earlier, slower-burning patriotisms.
Precisely. It didn't come out of nowhere.
What's really fascinating here, though, is how historians, according to Bailey, are now kind of shrinking the distance between Europe and the rest of the world on this whole concept of nationalism. The older view was that nationalism was basically invented in Europe and then exported, right?
That was the traditional narrative, yes.
Right.
Exported to Asia and Africa, often as a tool to resist colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries. But that view is being seriously rebalanced.
So what does that new understanding tell us? That similar processes were happening elsewhere, independently.
It tells us that focused identities, patriotic attachments to homelands, these things formed, dissolved, and reformed in Asia and Africa before major European expansion, or at least in its very early days. These were not simply invented traditions copied from Europe later on.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Even before 1776, you had locally born Creoles in the Americas, or settlers identifying as Americans or even Africans among communities in southern Africa resisting governors sent from Europe. That shows a nascent sense of local identity distinct from the colonizer.
And further afield, in Asia.
In Asia, absolutely. The Qianlong Emperor in 18th century China deliberately perpetuated a sense of Han Chinese identity through state rituals and cultural policies. In Sri Lanka, rulers nurtured a Sinhala Buddhist identity against Tamil Hindus and European Christians like the Portuguese.
And other established identities.
Burmese, Korean, Vietnamese identities were ancient, forged through shared language, religion, and long histories of conflict with powerful neighbors like China. Japanese patriotism, as we mentioned, flourished, marking itself off from outer barbarians and internal groups like the Ainu, often tied to that great domestication of their islands.
And we also saw the emergence of new, powerful regional kingdoms around this time, right?
Yeah.
Like in Nepal, Burma, Thailand, Iran. Did they foster identities?
Yes, the consolidation of kingdoms like Gurkha Nepal, a unified Burma, Thailand under the Chakri dynasty, Qajar, even Egypt under Muhammad Ali's monopoly state, or Moroccan efforts to centralize all these created larger political spaces where a sense of shared belonging, a kind of national definition, could emerge.
What about sub-Saharan Africa?
There too. Groups like the Yoruba or the Baganda had strong historical traditions and relatively centralized states. And think of Shaka's Zulu kingdom in the early 19th century, built through conquest, yes. But it forged a powerful, unified Zulu identity, pooling honor and loyalty among diverse groups through shared military struggle.
Okay, so if these forms of state building and identity formation were happening in various ways globally, what was Europe's actual distinction here? Why did it ultimately gain that period of preeminence? It wasn't just having states or patriotism.
Right. Europe's distinctiveness, Bailey suggests, wasn't necessarily just the existence of strong states or patriotic feelings in isolation. It was the specific convergence of factors we've discussed. That dynamic, market-driven economy, the highly effective, constantly innovating war-making capacity, and the intense rivalries between multiple, relatively evenly matched medium-sized states.
A unique combination.
A unique combination. Our source calls it an unpredictable accumulation, a specific set of conditions that created a powerful advantage. But, importantly, he also calls it a wasting asset. It wasn't permanent. Look at Japan's rapid modernization by 1870, achieving a kind of parallel modernity.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's another crucial element we need to discuss. The texture of society itself, this idea of civil society or the critical public. Jürgen Habermas's ideas about the public sphere have been really influential here, seeing it as something that could challenge the old order, allow new ideas to spread.
Yes, and on the surface, the West does seem to have had something distinctive going on here in the 18th century. Think about Benjamin Franklin again, his almost obsessive tendency to set up clubs and societies for discussion, mutual improvement, debate. The Junto Club is a famous example.
And linking ideas to action.
Exactly. His famous electricity experiments were matched by very practical initiatives for street lighting, firefighting, libraries. This close link between scientific theory and practical application seems to have been a strong, almost unspoken assumption in the Atlantic world.
And this wasn't necessarily separate from religious belief, was it?
Yeah.
We often think of the Enlightenment as purely secular.
Not at all. That's a key point. Protestantism, particularly the dissenting traditions, and even Protestant-influenced Catholicism, with their cellular structures and focus on individual conscience and improvement, provided fertile ground for this kind of civic republicanism and personal betterment through sociability.
So Franklin's background fits this.
Perfectly. His dissenting background, his later deism, his admiration for groups like the Quakers, Methodists, Moravians, it all fed into this ethos. His Junto Club explicitly focused on both social and personal moral improvement.
So we see this explosion of associations, clubs, societies, reading groups. What was the overall impact of all this joining and discussing?
Throughout Europe and its colonies, you see a similar flourishing. Middle-class men and even upwardly mobile artisans were participating in new clubs for all sorts of reasons: sociability, education, promoting trade, science, even sport. They had subscriptions, they kept minutes, they often published journals.
Creating a wider public sphere.
Exactly. It helped create a wider, more informed political class and a more critical public opinion. Now, it's crucial to remember the exclusions.
Right. This wasn't universal.
Absolutely not. Women were largely excluded, except perhaps in certain aristocratic salons. Working people's attempts to organize were often suppressed. Slaves were obviously excluded, despite some Quaker and Methodist anti-slavery advocacy. Religious minorities like Catholics in Britain or Jews almost everywhere faced restrictions. And native peoples were often dismissed or ignored. Franklin himself had pretty dismissive views of American Indians. Indians in British Calcutta were certainly outside this emerging civic sphere.
So a very specific, privileged public sphere in many ways.
Yes. But despite these significant exclusions, this proliferation of associations arguably gave Western societies, as Bailey puts it, considerable staying power and solidity. It fostered internal cohesion, facilitated the spread of capitalist practices, and allowed for critical public opinion to emerge and sometimes influence policy, contributing to political dynamism and perhaps external aggression, too.
Okay, but this picture isn't complete without looking again at Asian and African societies. Were there analogous forms of publics or social dynamism there, even if they looked different or were framed in religious terms?
Yes, absolutely. And this is crucial for avoiding a Eurocentric view. Changes in social organization were constantly happening in Asia and Africa. They were often framed in religious idioms, sure, but they reflected profound responses to global changes and internal pressures, not just adherence to tradition. Just like Franklin or Newton saw no inherent conflict between their faith and their scientific modernity, similar intellectual vigor existed elsewhere.
Can you give us some examples of these other kinds of publics or reform movements?
Well, within the Islamic world, for instance, the late 17th and 18th centuries saw significant movements of sociability and critical thought. There were reappraisals of the state and society happening, sometimes linked to the end of the first millennium of Islam. You had purification movements like the Wahhabis emerging in Arabia, but also efforts to re-strengthen Sufi mystical traditions, making them more orthodox or socially relevant.
An active reformer.
Yes. You had literate Muslim reformers emerging in North and West Africa trying to build what they saw as a proper, modern Islamic society based on revived principles. Shah Wali Allah in 18th century India was a major figure, reinterpreting Islamic law, stressing the importance of education, including for women, for social regeneration. Islamic teachers in places like Malaya and Indonesia were criticizing rulers for deviating from religious norms.
So new associations, learning, discipline.
Exactly. Spurred by the specific problems and changes of the 18th century, not simply as a reaction to Western impact, which came later.
And was there an exchange of knowledge? You mentioned Europeans borrowing, but was knowledge flowing the other way too?
Absolutely. It wasn't a one-way street, although the balance was shifting. Muslims were alert to outside changes. They translated European astronomical works, for example, gradually grappling with and sometimes accepting ideas like Copernicus's heliocentric model, a reversal of the earlier flow of astronomical knowledge from the Islamic world to Europe in the late Middle Ages.
So ideas and practices were moving in multiple directions.
Yes. Europeans borrowed Asian dyeing techniques crucial for their textile industries and adopted African and South American herbal remedies. Many specific European technical advances that fed into the Industrial Revolution actually drew inspiration or solutions from non-European practices initially.
What about India and China in this context of social and intellectual dynamism?
In India, society was also being galvanized by what are sometimes called dharma movements, often centered on charismatic religious teachers. These movements could challenge caste hierarchies, create new forms of congregation and social discipline, like with the Sikhs in the Punjab.
And China. We often hear about stagnation in the late Qing.
Well, the 18th century, particularly under Qianlong, is now seen by many historians as a period of intellectual expansion, not stagnation. There was a vibrant reinterpretation of Confucian classics, focused on statecraft and practical governance. New private academies flourished, and Western learning, introduced via Jesuits earlier, was debated.
What kind of scholarship was happening?
Scholars pursued what they called practical evidential research, focusing on verifiable facts in fields like astronomy, linguistics, mathematics, geography. Thinkers like Gu Yanwu emphasized this empirical approach. There were efforts to reform the rigid imperial examination system, often patronized by wealthy merchants outside the official bureaucracy.
So intellectual networks existed.
Yes, there was increased intellectual correspondence between scholars across the empire, analogs perhaps, to Europe's Republic of Letters. And the arts, painting, calligraphy, print culture all flourished, patronized by a growing commercial class as well as the court. It might have been past-oriented in its rhetoric, but it was also intensely practical, spurred by the challenges of governing a vast empire and the dynamism of commerce. Echoes of this were seen in tributary kingdoms like Korea, too.
And Japan, with its unique path.
Japan, too, showed remarkable intellectual adaptability alongside its buoyant economy. You had Dutch learning knowledge trickling in via the single Dutch trading post. There was commercial reporting, keeping merchants informed, samurai engaged in scholarly pursuits, and significantly, criticism of the Tokugawa government often focused on present-day abuses and practical reforms, rather than just abstract philosophy.
Okay, so if there was intellectual dynamism and social change happening across the globe, what then was the crucial difference? Bailey points to this idea of scientific egotism in the West. What does that mean?
It's a subtle but potentially crucial distinction he draws. In Asia or Africa, scholars and innovators often worked within established schools, lineages, or under court patronage. Their success was often tied to the group or the patron.
Whereas in the West?
In the West, he argues, there was a growing culture where individual scholars could gain significant personal fame, reputation, even fortune through public controversy and recognized discovery, especially in fields like astronomy, mechanics, medicine. Think of figures like Newton or later Lavoisier.
And institutions supported this.
Active universities, though often conservative, provided one arena, but also those dense networks of associations, academies, philosophical societies. They created platforms for debate, publication, and recognition. The Linnaean system of classification, for example, brought fame to Linnaeus. Charting the solar system brought renown.
And the link to practical application.
The patenting system, particularly strong in Britain, became important here. It explicitly bridged the world of artisanal innovation and tincturing with the world of formal knowledge and, crucially, commerce. It made money-making itself a respectable driver for both practical and philosophical knowledge advancement.
How did that compare elsewhere?
Bailey suggests that in places like India or China, the distance between the skilled artisan and the scholar or the royal court was often greater. The pathways for an individual inventor to achieve widespread fame or great wealth through their innovation alone were perhaps less established, less central to the culture of knowledge.
So the core difference wasn't necessarily a lack of knowledge or skill elsewhere, but something about the structure and rewards.
Precisely. He concludes that the intellectual buoyancy of the European idea of the advance of knowledge and its material rewards was perhaps the most significant differentiating factor, rather than any specific invention or inherent intellectual superiority.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this deep dive mean for how we understand the birth of the modern world? We've seen people inside and outside Europe grappling with remarkably similar, interconnected problems. Conflicts between old ideals and new social realities, managing uneven wealth, critiquing political power.
It leads us to a really powerful conclusion, I think. European and North American preeminence during this period wasn't simply due to some inherent backwardness or stagnation in Asia or Africa. That's far too simplistic and, frankly, often wrong.
So what was it then?
It was, as we've discussed, a specific convergence of factors that happened to come together most powerfully there for a time. First, Europeans were more intensely mobilized for, and perhaps more ruthless in, warfare, with that constant competition driving innovation in military tech and finance. Ironically, Asia's relative peace in the 17th century might have hindered that specific kind of competitive military fiscal evolution.
And what about those legal frameworks we talked about?
That's the second key element, that unique legal framework for capital. Codes of law that increasingly bound rulers as well as subjects, foreigners as well as locals, creating a level of trust and long-term expectation about property rights and contracts that seems to have been crucial for guaranteeing capital reproduction on a large scale.
Less common elsewhere.
Less consistently applied or perhaps structured differently in parts of Asia, where legal jurisdictions might be farmed out to local governors, or where religious law, deeply intertwined with civil law, could create different kinds of expectations and flexibility around property and contracts.
And finally, that critical public or civil society element.
Yes, the third leg of the stool, perhaps.
Yeah.
Europe and its American colonies seem to have developed a greater density of these civil institutions operating outside the direct control of the state, the print culture, the myriad associations. These provided powerful channels for articulating public opinion, generating and disseminating information both useful and critical at a massive rate. This arguably provided a crucial dynamism for change and adaptation.
So the trick then, if you can call it that, was Europe's unique ability, for a time, to combine this intense, aggressive, competitive state system with burgeoning commerce, underpinned by specific legal and financial institutions, and a culture of vigorous public critique and information sharing.
That seems to be the core argument. An unpredictable accumulation, as Bailey describes it, that gave them a distinct edge during this transformative period.
And this period itself, roughly 1780, 1820, feels almost like a hinge point in history.
Absolutely. Bailey suggests thinking of it as a kind of axial age for world history, where the revolutionary state itself, more powerful, more intrusive, more demanding rather than just nascent industrialization, became this gargantuan new actor on the world stage, driving global changes before the full impact of steam power or the telegraph had even begun to register widely.
So we've taken a really deep dive today looking into these complex currents of global change, trying to reveal a far more nuanced story than those simple narratives of just industrialization or Western exceptionalism. As you, our listener, reflect on all this, maybe consider this provocative thought. How much of what we consider modern today, from our economic systems, our political structures, even down to our personal consumer habits, still carries the deep imprint of these varied, often simultaneous, interconnected revolutions? And the specific, sometimes brutal advantages that happen to accumulate in certain regions of the world during this pivotal 18th and early 19th century period.
What does that complex, messy historical tapestry mean for how we understand progress and development even now in the 21st century?
It really encourages us to look beyond simplistic cause and effect, doesn't it?
And appreciate the unpredictable, contingent, and truly global forces that have shaped and continue to shape our world.
We hope you'll keep exploring these fascinating connections and keep questioning those easy assumptions about how the modern world really came to be.